Are we live? Yeah. Maybe give it a minute.
You going to be able to run that clip from the Matamoros workers as part of your coverage?
Not live, but
Yeah, okay, great.
Which clip?
There is Mexican workers in Matamoros. There's been a wave of strikes at U.S. and Canadian parts factories.
Okay.
And we have linked together Mexican and American and Canadian workers to talk to one another. So there's a video on a picket line in Matamoros in which the workers are expressing their solidarity with American workers.
That's great. I know they brought up, a few people brought up that concern last night about this anti-Mexican sentiment that was coming from Canadians and Americans.
From the unions.
Yeah, from the unions. Yeah, Canadian American unions. Yeah. And the people that was there last night didn't like it. They hated it, and they voiced it, which I think is great. It's absurd how somehow we don't realize like what the powerful are doing, like how they try to like manipulate us against each other. You know what I mean? Instead of looking at, because they don't want us to look at what's actually going on, who's actually taking the money, who's actually corrupting the system, which is them. So they.
Of course, the unions are part of that system.
Oh, I'm in 100% agreement.
That's why they have a stake in
Yeah.
national.
You know, I mean, that's it's a whole lot of. We interviewed some people today. It's a whole lot of things that I understood. I mean, like found out. I'm like, oh, the unions are a big part of it. The unions are a huge part. They condone a lot of things. They allow things to go on. They don't even have a system where you guys can like elect a national person. It's like a person that doesn't have to campaign. You don't know who the person is. He don't have to work for your vote. He's just, I guess, appointed.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, that's troublesome in itself. You know what I mean? So.
And they have a financial incentive. The unions control 100 million stocks of General Motors. They have a financial incentive to cut wages, to cut jobs, to cut retiree health benefits.
Yeah.
So that's the difference we have with the group of people that you went to last night. Their perspective is that you can reform the UAW. We're calling for workers to build rank and file committees that are completely independent. Plant by plant, absolutely. But we're developing a steering committee of workers throughout, not only the auto industry, but teachers and other sections. And of course, we see this not only as an American question, we're striving to link up American workers' struggles with workers internationally. But that's what happened in Matamoros. It wasn't the unions that sanctioned the strike. They were rebelling against the union. In fact, they're carrying banners. The Matamoros workers are carrying banners that says the union and the bosses are killing the working class. That's their popular.
Of course they are. Unions are, corporations are. I mean, if you go to the DNC, we had to follow the DNC chair race last year, and it was like the union was right there with them. I'm like, there's no way you're not conflicted. There's no way. No matter how good your intentions may be, there's no way you're not conflicted. You guys are doing way too much. You're way too involved not to be conflicted with this whole thing.
The thing is that they're not conflicted. They're on the side.
And just to add the title right, Jeremy,
The labor editor of the World Socialist website.
and the World Socialist website on YouTube. And labor editor of the World Socialist website. And exactly, it's free capitalism. And it's not a challenge to the policies of the system. Or the Wall Street Journal ran an interesting article acknowledging that Cortez's position was pretty sandy. It's not about a challenge to the system at all. More than it's matter. Many of the policies were like U.S. policy up until the 1970s and 80s. Take an example, taxing the rich. Up until 1980, I think it was 70%. Yeah. You know, the Reagan came along.
Is Tlaib there last night? Because then, as Larry said, the Reagan the Democratic Socialists in America tells working people like the Democrats, which are part of the Washington, depending on how you transform into some type of progressive, people call it socialist party. It's not. They call the same all the same things in the last elections. And they're also claiming, they're claiming that socialism, insofar as we talk about it at all, is sort of handful of money, social reforms, which we never accede to in any case. The Democratic Party would never pursue. And she's Cortez, Ocasio-Cortez, she's running as far as she can when we talk about abolishing ICE, and she endorsed Pelosi, it's another effort to make this sort of face that.
Hasn't said anything. Thanks. I'll send you guys the story after if you haven't seen it.
Sure.
We're just going to play hot potatoes. I'm going to hand you the mic.
Okay.
Cool. Hey, it's Jordan. I am here still in Detroit. Yesterday we covered a meeting with some current and former auto workers about the layoffs that are hitting Detroit. They're hitting Lordstown, Ohio. They're hitting Maryland, Ontario, Canada, and basically General Motors, a continuation of what we've seen, which is essentially corporations being given billions and billions of dollars, very little strings attached, and then they lay off the workers. So it's a little bit more complicated than that, but I also wanted to bring you a little bit of a different perspective because there are also problems with the labor unions, and the labor unions kind of between corruption and not exactly fighting for the actual workers. So I wanted to bring a socialist perspective to the equation. I'm here with Jerry White. You are the labor editor for the World Socialist website. Larry Porter, who is the Assistant National Secretary of the Socialist Equality Party and used to work for Chrysler. So you know these wars way better than I. So thanks for doing it. First wanted to ask, you guys, I missed it, but you did a protest on Saturday against exactly what we're talking about. Can you kind of talk about what we're seeing in Detroit, Warren, where a plant is closing specifically? We're not seeing mass like strikes or anything like that. It seems like workers are deathly afraid to speak out or organize right now. Beyond your protest, are we seeing any real action here against these layoffs?
Well, the demonstration that we held on Saturday, February 9th, gave expression to a very deep sentiment of anger and opposition to the plant closings. Workers are totally outraged over this. The shutdown of 3 major assembly plants and 2 transmission plants is going to have a devastating impact on areas already hit by years of deindustrialization. There is enormous opposition, which is why we organized the demonstration, because workers also know the UAW, the United Auto Workers, will do nothing to oppose this. For 40 years, the UAW has told workers that if they give up wage and benefit concessions, that this would save your jobs. They've told us for years that the enemy is not the corporations, let alone capitalism, but the workers of Japan or the workers of Mexico. So they are also heavily invested. The union itself is a corporation. Even though they lost 600,000 union members in the big three since 1979, the assets of the UAW has actually gone up over $1 billion. They control 100 million shares of General Motors stock itself. So we held this demonstration, and it was called by the steering committee of the Coalition of Rank-and-File Committees and the World Socialist website Auto Worker Newsletter in order to fight for three things. One, the building of rank-and-file committees completely independent of the UAW and Unifor in Canada to mobilize workers against the plant closings, against demands for concessions. Two, that this is not just an American or even just an American and Canadian issue. There's a global restructuring of the auto industry. Workers are losing their jobs in Europe, in South America, in Asia. And our demonstration rejected the anti-Mexican campaign of the UAW and Unifor and called for the greatest unity of workers throughout North America. And as you'll see on our website, there's a statement from the striking workers in Matamoros who have carried out a rebellion against their unions, and they issued a statement calling for the unity of all workers, the U.S. and Canadian. And finally, we say that rank-and-file committees must not accept what the corporations say is affordable or profitable. They have to begin with the needs of workers. GM is closing this plant, and over the last, these 5 plants, and over the last 4 years, while they've slashed wages and cut jobs, they've funneled almost $14 billion into stock buybacks that only benefit the richest investors, including Mr. Warren Buffett, already the 3rd richest man in the world.
And their executives who are largely paid in stock.
Oh, yeah, like Mary Barra herself has the most stocks of any individual. And, of course, she got on a call with Wall Street investors just last week when they announced that they had made $11.8 billion in profits, and she said, I am committed to you, our owners, for long-term and short-term profit making. And the money that they've given to stock buybacks is almost 3 times the money that they're going to, quote, save from closing these factories. So we believe that the rights of workers, including the right to a secure and good-paying job, must take precedence over the private profits of the super rich, and that workers have to begin to mobilize on that basis.
I'd like to ask you a question because both some folks I talked to last night at the local meeting in response to this, as well as some workers I talked to today. They're from Fiat Chrysler. But on the workers' part, the thought was, good-natured on their part, well, we gave back pretty much we gave back the farm after the bailout, concessions, whether it be pensions, wages, the influx of temporary workers. So they thought with General Motors making, I think, almost record profits the last few years, they'd start to get some of those concessions back. So I'm not calling them naive, but what I am saying is the thought on the worker is, wait a minute, you have record profits right now, and you're basically hammering us over the head. You used to work at Chrysler. It seems to me that really what General Motors has been doing is what a lot of corporations have been doing, hammering you over the head so you're desperate, like we're going to lay off 15,000 people, so that you'll take anything at the time of contract negotiations.
Well, there's no question that the policies of Barra and General Motors is to preempt and, in fact, threaten the workers that if there's any action taken at all, they're going to lose their jobs, and to use the jobs as a hammer against the workers. The announcement of 5 plants that were going to be closed is just the beginning, as a matter of fact. But that's being used again to as a tool to threaten the workers, and also to show that they're prepared to do anything necessary in order to make the profits, even when the economy is in a recession. When they negotiated the contract back in 2009, they did it with the agreement of Obama to institute the tier system as an institution within the company.
Can you explain the tier system?
The tier system, first they had a 2-tier system whereby the new hires came in at half the wages. That was part of the agreement for the bailout, both for General Motors as well as for Chrysler. Since then, they've instituted now at least 4 or 5 different tiers, whereby workers now are part-time workers. Workers are coming in from temporary agencies, making as little as a little bit more than minimum wage. And all of the workers are doing the same work, including the older workers. On that basis, the company's making enormous profits. And in fact, that's one of the arguments they're making about bringing the jobs back to the U.S. is that they're able to make a higher level of profit in the U.S. than they can in other countries. So this is something that the UAW agreed to. At the same time, when they made that agreement in 2009, as Jerry was raising, they made an agreement to take over the health care of the workers, the VIBA, they call it the VIBA, and on that basis get the stock from the company.
This was the UAW who took over the health care.
Retirees health care. It's astonishing what we're talking about here. As Jerry said, 100 million, but in Chrysler, they have 55% ownership of the stock of Chrysler. It's astonishing. I mean, they're in partnership with the company. And when you have that kind of stock, I mean, many workers say there's a conflict of interest, but I mean, you're in partnership now. In fact, you benefit from the cuts and the attacks being carried out against the working class. In General Motors, it's 18%, and in Ford, it's 11%. The institutional policy now is UAW/GM, UAW/Ford, UAW/Chrysler. So that, you know, for the workers, they are dealing with both the and the company when they're fighting to defend their jobs or any benefit today. So workers realize that, but the main problem they face is what do you do about it? How do you change it? And this is where the opposition is beginning to really begin to develop. In 2015, in Chrysler workers, for the first time in 30 years, they voted down the last contract. That's just the beginning. And the support we got for the demonstration expressed that. There's just widespread anger and opposition to the policies being carried out both by the company as well as by the union.
And it also seems that General Motors' strategy, and according to you, UAW's strategy, if they're working in tandem, is just divide and conquer. So hire as many temps as you can. Those temporary workers are actually taking away from the full-time workers overtime, those kinds of things.
Yeah, what's actually done, this was accelerated in the 2015 contract. There used to be a case where the TPTs, the part-time temporary workers, would only be hired come in on Fridays and Mondays to make up for absenteeism. But the UAW agreed to allow TPTs to come in anytime that they want. These are neither part-time or temporary workers. TPTs can work often 40 hours a week, and they can be a TPT for years, paying UAW dues and having absolutely no contract rights whatsoever. They are disposable workers. They have no transfer rights. They don't get the profit-sharing check. They're super exploited. And there's a sympathy among the older workers because they know that these workers are being terribly exploited. In some cases, it's their own sons and daughters. Mm-hmm. So, yes, the UAW has done everything it can. You know, when you think of the word union, right, it conjures up this idea that workers recall of past struggles, the Flint sit-down strikes, the unity of workers, black, white, immigrant, native-born, all workers, the right to equal pay for equal work. Well, that doesn't describe what this organization is. It does everything it can to divide workers. Young against old, first tier against second tier, against TPT, American workers against workers in other countries. So, and as they've agreed to these contracts, of course in 2015, you know, we fought, and the World Socialist website, Auto Worker Newsletter, was the center of opposition to the contract. And the UAW was denouncing us as outside agitators. They even coined the term at the time "fake news." When it
sounds like Bill O'Reilly back in the day.
Yeah, exactly. But who? And then it turned out that in fact the UAW officials were paid millions of dollars in bribes by Fiat Chrysler, funneled through the UAW Chrysler Training Center here in Detroit. You know, the General Holyfield and other Norwood Jewell, all these other people. They went off to Palm Springs on golf circuits. Their wives got designer shoes made in Italy worth $10,000. I mean, these people are on the other side. And many workers know that. That's why the issue of the independent organization of workers. I mean, look, when the Flint sit-down strike happened in 36, 37, the workers actually rebelled against the old American Federation of Labor Unions, which were also pro-company and so on. They had to build something new, the CIO at the time. And workers today are going to have to build something new. It's an interesting historical fact. When the sit-down strike took place in Flint, the first judge tried to get an injunction to force the workers out of the factory, but it was exposed that the judge had 36,000 shares of GM stock. Well, the UAW has 100 million shares of General Motors stock, but it won't recuse itself, you know, because it's in the business of policing the workers as a cheap labor contractor, and they control assets worth over $1 billion. So again, that's why we are fighting for the development of rank-and-file committees based on the democratically elected by workers to fight for industrial democracy, to fight for workers' control over line speed, over safety. We insist that workers should have the right to observe all negotiations. There should be no negotiations behind the backs of workers. In fact, they should be live streamed. Workers should advance their own demands in this upcoming contract, including a 40% wage increase. They've had frozen wages for years. The abolishing of all tiers among workers, the conversion of all temporary workers into full-time workers, and that they begin a fight. But again, this has got to be bound up. It's not just auto workers. I mean, if you take Amazon workers or UPS workers, or teachers are on strike right now in Denver. They were on strike in Los Angeles, you know, last month. In every case, and of course West Virginia, Oklahoma, and Arizona last year, in every case that workers strive to assert their interests, they run directly up against these trade union organizations, which are tied to the corporations and above all to the Democratic Party. So we believe that a movement is coming. In fact, the logic of the opposition is towards a general strike. There is immense anger. I mean, we live in a country where 3 billionaires control more wealth than the bottom 160 million people, you know? And you got Democrats and Republicans, you know, at each other's throats, but they all agree with defending the rich. They all agree with wars to defend the rich, you know? But what they're debating one another over, is it best to go to war against China first or to go to war against Russia first?
Or Venezuela.
Or Venezuela first, right. Well, I think they all agree on that one. But of course, the working class has no interest in oppressing any worker anywhere in the world. And we have a stake in making sure there isn't a third world war.
So wait, you're telling me that I've been lied to and it's not Russian trolls online that are attacking our democracy?
No, I think every time there's social opposition in America, including the auto workers, it's got to be the Putin and the Russians that are behind it, of course.
I want to push back a little bit just to play devil's advocate, because if you speak with some UAW committeemen or this and that, they say to folks like you, it's a lot more complicated. There's a lot of layers, and the UAW has won certain concessions for transfer rights and things like that. I know what I know what I don't know. So I ask you, is there some good that the UAW is doing, or in general have they been, excuse my French, collaborating and bending over for GM? And it's not just GM, many other companies too.
It's the latter. There's no question that they're giving up every right. We were just covering a case of a terrible tragedy involving a young man at the Woodhaven stamping plant, Jacoby Hennings. He was 20 years old. He was a temporary worker. And in fact, he was working 2 different temporary jobs, one at Chrysler and one at Ford, in order to make ends meet. He had a grievance about the conditions inside the plant and went in to speak to the union officials. He was in their offices for an hour. And supposedly, in the course of that, they claim he committed suicide. And but it was a very tense condition. He was well known to be an outspoken spokesperson against the conditions inside of his plant. We don't believe that what the union has said has been true at all. In fact, the family has not been able to get the full story about what happened inside that plant. So you want to ask about the conditions inside the plant facing workers every day. They're told to go along with what you are doing because there's a lot of other people out there who will come in and do the same job. And the conditions have deteriorated enormously inside the plants. On the basic grievance levels, on every level. And so the argument that, well, they're working behind the scenes and they're trying to do this and that and the other, many workers would give a very artful phrase, to explain what they really think about the union and its policies.
What phrase is that?
We're on.
It's the internet. You can say what you want.
By the way, in terms of transfer rights, this is nonsense. They're telling workers to uproot their families from Detroit. Some of them have to move as far away as Arlington, Texas, or Tennessee, or Kentucky to retain a job. How are you supposed to do that when you have family and uproot? And in many cases, this is not the first time workers were uprooted. There's something called the GM gypsies, because it's happened to people so many times. You can uproot your family, and then your factory can be the next to close. So in terms of any rights that are left, it's not because of the UAW, it's because of what was fought for by an earlier generation, including the Flint sit-down strike. Yesterday was the 82nd anniversary of the end of the 44-day sit-down strike, when workers seized the property of the largest corporation in the planet in a city where there were ordinances passed that if more than 2 workers were on a corner, they could be arrested for, quote, bunching, where General Motors had industrial spies and thugs to beat workers up. And it was underground work to organize the sit-down strike. And that was a heroic struggle. The union, the UAW, long ago spit upon those traditions. By the way, those were the traditions that were fought for by the socialists who built the UAW. In the 1940s and early 50s, Walter Reuther carried out a vicious purge of the UAW, tied it to the Democratic Party, and prevented any, and tried to root out of the UAW it's those traditions that were behind its building, And today, as Larry said, the UAW doesn't even hide that it's a partner with management. It boasts about it. Everything is UAW Ford, UAW GM, and so on. An earlier generation would roll over in its grave,
And something that the more I talk to people, it seems to me that General Motors, these other automakers' calculation is China, double down, because the Chinese government gives people subsidies for electric cars, something we should be doing a lot more of, so they see more profit in China. It seems like they've been doubling down on trying to sell in China and other countries. Well,
China right now is actually a larger car market than the United States is, so all of the automakers, whether it was GM, Ford, or Renault and others, flooded in. But of course, since China is connected up to the world economy, which is now once again entering into a slowdown. There's also the impact of the tariffs. There's an economic slowdown in China as well, and auto workers are losing their jobs in China as well. Mm-hmm. So this is, they have a global strategy. They shift production anywhere in the world to try to find the cheapest sources of labor. And the unions, which are rooted in nationalism, had no progressive answer to the development of globalization in the late 70s and early 80s. What was their answer? Telling workers their enemies were the Japanese and working with the employers to cut labor costs to try to attract finance capital here. And the German unions do the same thing. The British unions do the same thing. So this is why the whole perspective of nationalism of the trade unions is completely reactionary, and why an international and global strategy of the working class is needed.
And when you talk about the Flint sit-down strikes, 1937, the minimal research I've done, it's, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he didn't send in the National Guard to stop it. He let things play out. The governor of Michigan at the time, it seems, correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, wasn't sending in wasn't trying to shut it down immediately. In today's day and age with a general strike, I mean, we live in a police state. I mean, I was at Standing Rock. You have police basically, battering people with rubber bullets and tear gas and all this in protection of a private oil company. So when you talk about a general strike, do you think in this kind of capitalist corporate system that workers could freely strike?
Well, they did attack the workers in Flint. As a matter of fact, it was a famous case where they came in with gas, throwing in gas bombs and so forth and so on. They began breaking out windows in order to get the air out so that people wouldn't be suffocating within the plant. It was not true. When the National Guard did come, there was the danger that they were turned against the workers. There's no question about it. The governor at that time was afraid of an explosive development taking place within the Detroit and Flint area. If you recall, in 1934, there were 3 major general strikes in America. Toledo, auto light strike, and a lot of workers from Toledo came up to Flint to assist the workers there. The Minneapolis general strike, which was led actually by the Socialists and the over-the-road drivers, and in San Francisco. So we're talking about an explosive period of struggles on the part of the working class that if they had called in a National Guard to come in and attack those workers, there's no question about it that this country would have gone up. So it wasn't a measure to, because it was in fact because they were afraid of an explosion taking place that they backtracked on those issues. Without the independent movement of the working class, nothing would have happened in terms of the struggle taking place among the workers in the CIO. I do want to go back to what's happening today because there are many lessons, and we're talking today really at a higher level than we were in the 1930s. The class struggle has been suppressed for the last 30 years, not just in America. This has been an international phenomenon. And as Jerry was saying, that the answer of all the unions internationally has been to make alliances with their corporations and to promote nationalism. This may sound a little bit afield, but I think this is appropriate. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, which was considered to be socialist, which it never was. It was, in fact, a socialist revolution, but you had a bureaucracy which came to power, usurped power from the workers, and you had the development of Stalinism. But when it collapsed, it was said that this is somehow going to lead to more peace. It was going to be and so forth and so on throughout the world. Just the opposite. You've had more wars than you've had in any other period in history since 1992. But what it also signaled. And the reason why the Soviet Union collapsed is because of the nationalism of its own policies within the period of globalization. We concluded from that development that it was really the death knell of nationalism on a world scale, of all the organizations based on the working class, and especially the trade unions, and they could not provide an orientation for the working class. And that the only solution would be for the working class to begin to unite on a global scale, and that, in fact, the struggles that we'll be developing would be global struggles. And while they would take a national form, they would inevitably be against many of the same companies, which were international corporations, and involve workers uniting on a global scale. I think we're beginning to see that.
I want to, because, hey, I can admit it, I've probably wrongly stated this before, railing about, oh, you're sending the jobs to Mexico and China, this and that. But something you guys have been saying, and socialists, is this is a strategy by General Motors and the UAW to pit, U.S. workers versus Mexican workers versus other countries, and it's actually, you're looking at the wrong thing. Can you kind of talk about why we need solidarity with Mexican workers?
I mean, look, there's no such thing as a Mexican car, or an American car, or a German car. The cars have 30,000 parts in it, produced by workers all over the globe. Not to mention those who mined and develop the raw materials. So corporations, transnational corporations, and that was a phenomenon that developed in the 80s and the 90s. It used to be where there were just multinational companies. So if it was a GM factory in Brazil, it produced for the Brazilian market. Transnational production meant in the production of a single commodity, the work was distributed in many, many, many countries. So that gave the capitalists the ability to constantly distribute production, shift production wherever they can get the highest rate of profit. So when the trade unions were confronted with that, they are rooted in the national market, in the national labor pool. So their response to that was, don't shift production to another country. We'll voluntarily lower labor costs in our country in order to save our capitalists and make our capitalists more competitive. Meanwhile, the unions like the UAW carried out a vicious, racist, anti-Japanese campaign in the 1980s that led to the tragic death of a Chinese American by the name of Vincent Chin in 1982, who was beaten to death by a Chrysler foreman and his unemployed stepson. And so the issue of the international unity of the working class isn't some kind of utopia or something that you only save for holiday speechifying. It's a strategic question. You can't fight global corporations, globally organized corporations, on a national scale. It's like saying we're going to fight General Motors only in Michigan, but they have operations in Ohio, Illinois, and so on, and they move it. So the issue of the practical unity of the working class, the establishment of links of communication, coordination, is a life and death matter for workers. And that's why I encourage your listeners to watch this video of the striking Matamoros workers. They work for a company called Fisher, which is actually based in Michigan, but of course it pays 75 cents an hour to these workers there. They rebelled against their unions. In fact, one of the first things the Matamoros workers did was they marched to the U.S. border, and they said, "Gringos, wake up! Americans, wake up!"
Was that the caravan that Trump was talking about?
Well, actually, that caravan was one of their slogans are "We are international workers," and all the vicious anti-immigrant baiting, which of course the Democrats fully support. I mean, they've just cut a deal with Trump on the issue of the wall and so forth. They all want to divide the working class. They all want to promote nationalism, the lie that because everybody is the same all Americans, that somehow we all have the same class interests. Excuse me, an American worker has a hell of a lot more in common with a Mexican worker than he does with Mary Barra or an American or Bill Gates or Warren Buffett or any of these people. And this is a class struggle. It isn't an issue of gender. It isn't an issue of race. You want to see, you got women running. Mary Barra runs General Motors. Is that a great advance for womanhood? No. She's a capitalist. She's ruthlessly attacking the jobs of men and women, throwing them into poverty. So the issue is the working class has to be united, and it has to be done on an international scale.
I just want to read by the way, I haven't been being rude. I want to bring in some comments from the viewers. One viewer said, working class internationalism, one global working class united and coordinated, a global workers' army to wage the class war. So a lot are digging what you're saying.
Well, I agree with the sentiments by your readers here. And I'm glad that they're making such statements, as a matter of fact, because they are our greatest ally. They're not our enemies. In fact, the UAW and Unifor right now have launched a proposal for boycotting all Mexican cars. And this is the first time the UAW and Unifor has gotten together on anything. They split some 30-some years ago over nationalism and over who can offer the companies the highest, the most concessions and keep the jobs against each other.
I just want the audience to know. Unifor is the Canadian.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
Which used to be called the Canadian Auto Workers Union, which was part of the UAW until 1986, and they split, like Larry said, along national lines.
No, the issue of uniting with the Mexican workers isn't because We believe it's just a, we have to be united with our brothers and sisters. As Jerry was saying, it is a strategic question. If the working class is to win and defend any of its jobs today, it has to unite with its international brothers and sisters. Because the companies today can easily move production any other location, and they'll try to use workers against each other. It's similar to what happened in the 1930s by Henry Ford when he brought in black workers from the South into the plants in Rouge and so forth. They tried to use the black workers against the white workers to keep the workers from uniting and having a union. And it was the socialists who were able to fight and unite the working class to understand, black and white workers, that this is a unified struggle. We have to stand together in opposition in order for us to have that right. And that was the hardest company to unionize. Ford was only unionized in 1940, 3 years after the General Motors location, because of that strategy of the divide and conquer. So we're saying to the workers now, look, many of the plants that are out on strike in Mexico are actually affecting plants right here in Detroit and throughout the country. It's the same companies. And as a matter of fact, many international companies are involved in Mexico. So this issue of the unification of the working class is extremely important and strategic. Without that, we cannot win, in fact, and defend the rights for any section of the working class.
Well, I'll also touch on, I don't know what your thoughts are of the Yellow Vest movement in France, but seems relatively organized, and they got concessions from Macron. I don't know how good they were, pretty quickly. But they were willing to actually shut things down and be a little bit more disruptive. What are your thoughts on what's going on there in relation to the things we're talking about?
Well, the most significant reason why that struggle has had any sustaining power is that it's been independent of the unions. The CGT and the other unions have tried to sort of co-opt it, and the workers have resisted it. The unions are equally as discredited in France as they are in the United States. Now, Macron didn't make any real concessions to the workers. In fact, he's been sending his riot police week after these workers. But increasingly, we're seeing rebellions against these old pro-capitalist and nationalist organizations, and that's the tendency which is emerging. What has to be done, however, is that there has to be a conscious leadership developed to link together workers, first of all, throughout France and throughout all of Europe. In fact, the Yellow Vest movement, there's going to be a general strike in Belgium in several days. In the Netherlands, there's strike wave growing in South Africa, in Zimbabwe, in Kenya. There's a strike. There was just a general strike, one of the largest, 200 million workers in India. There were many workers who sent in their greetings to our demonstration, not only from Mexico, but also the Maruti Suzuki workers in India, 13 of whom were framed up and sentenced to life in prison because they rebelled against the pro-company union in the Japanese-owned company. We got tea plantation workers in Sri Lanka, German workers, Turkish workers. Increasingly, workers are sensing, as Larry indicated, that this is a global issue, that the use of nationalism is just the oldest trick in the book to divide and conquer workers. And of course, the issue of nationalism isn't as serious as the declining living standards are. Of course, nationalism is also what's used to tell workers that they should send their sons and daughters to kill workers in other countries over which gang of capitalists is going to control, oil and other raw materials and control markets. So the issue of the fight for the international unity of the working is a life and death question, because every country, including Macron, whose French imperialism is back at it in Africa, the Americans, as you said, Venezuela, what they call their backyard, and also the largest oil reserves in the planet. All of these imperialism is rearing its ugly head once again, and the only way to oppose the dangers of World War III is the international unity of the working class.
I'd like to talk about a topic that I think will rejuvenate all of us here, the Democratic Party, because I was blasted, during 2016. I actually covered Hillary Clinton pretty critically and aggressively, which, I'm attacked all the time. You elected Trump, and I said, thank you for giving me that power that I'm so great, so powerful. But to me, this hysteria over Trump, and he's a dangerous man, I don't want to minimize it, and he's done some terrible things. However, it seems that the Democratic Party is basically running on, Trump is the Antichrist, Trump everything, and put us back in so we could give you a few tax credits and crumbs for the workers. But the Democratic Party has basically been bought off by Wall Street equal to, if not more, than the Republican Party. What are your thoughts on the Democratic Party is trying to basically stifle the things you guys are talking about?
Well, the Democratic Party, let's take the Obama era.
Be careful. He thinks Obama's like Jesus.
Transferred more wealth to the rich than any other president in American history. Carried out massive cuts in social programs against the working class. 350,000 teachers, I think, lost their jobs during the period when Obama was in office, despite the fact that Randy Weingarten and the teachers' unions continued to support them and were the first ones to jump in line to support them. Obama, in fact, all the promises he made of, that he was going to create a health care position for to help the working class, change you can believe in, and all the rest, it was because of the lies that were carried out by the Democratic Party that Trump actually won the election and swung people over to supporting such a demagogue as Trump. And, many of the workers, especially white workers, black and white workers, voted for Obama twice, and still nothing changed in terms of the policies by the Democratic Party. So, when we talk about the policies of the Democratic Party, they carried out the most sweeping attacks against the rights of the working class than any other time in history. Look, it was under Obama that they've inaugurated the policy of drone attacks and murders, including those of American citizens, and justified it. Bush's policy before that was they would just, arrest people and throw them in Guantanamo and so forth and so on and kill them. Obama used drones, but they didn't change their policy in terms of war. They in fact expanded them. So Hillary Clinton's position, one thing Trump said which is true, he said in the State of the Union that if Clinton had won the election, we'd be at war right now. It's absolutely true, because she was calling for the division of Syria along the lines that they did in Vietnam, where they create demilitarized zones and so forth and so on, divide up the country, and on that basis, anyone who crossed the line would immediately be in violation of their laws, and they therefore would be justified to go to war. This is a complete war policy on the part of the Democratic Party. And to this day, they support the nationalism of the Trump policy. They're not indifferent. The main difference is over international policy. The Democrats are launching they would like to go to war against Russia in particular first, whereas Trump has chosen China as being his main competitor. And in terms of the differences and so forth. And the Democratic Party has the closest relationships to the military than any other, than the Republican Party, as well as to Wall Street. So how is that a party that's going to defend the interests of the working class, and what has it actually shown that it's prepared to do over the last 10 years?
Well, I will just point out, and it is, you're not going to hear from me, let me be fair to Hillary Clinton, because I agree with you. That was one of the reasons I said I personally can't vote for her. I didn't vote for Trump either. But, Trump has only doubled down on this drone program. We're still, we're still helping Saudi Arabia and Yemen. We're still bombing, 7 or 8 countries. So Trump's pretty down with the war too. It's just he hasn't started a new ground war.
Yeah, and of course lifting the ban on expansion of nuclear weapons and so forth. Look, Trump is he's a billionaire. Of course, he was a former Democrat as well. Good friend of the Clintons, by the way.
He changed parties several times.
Yeah. But look, he has a strategy. Him and Bannon and others and Miller, they would like to build a fascistic movement. They tell workers that the cause of their social dislocation and their social concerns is because of Mexicans robbing the wealth, and the United States must be great again. And of course the vicious attacks on immigrant workers, massive tax cuts to the rich, more and more sort of authoritarian measures. But one thing must be said about the Democratic Party. What other party in the world could be so rotten and so pro-big business, so militarist, that Trump could palm himself off as a representative of working people and a peacemaker? I mean, only the Democrats could do that.
I always say, because I still need therapy, but I covered about 30 to 40 Trump rallies, a lot of them in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. I mean, he had them at NAFTA. As soon as he was ranting about NAFTA, they were buying it hook. I don't blame them, based on what's happened in the Midwest. So it seems that Trump understood the anger where the Democratic Party is kind of, it's kind of the Democratic Party with black people. They say, well, what else are you going to do? You're going to go to the Republican Party?
Well, the Democratic Party is utilizing identity politics now, and they are, in fact, turning in that direction even more so in the last period. I think it's quite striking, for example, that they chose Stacey Abrams to be their spokesperson after Trump's State of the Union address. Mm-hmm. And she's promoting, of course, herself, but she's promoting especially identity politics, and particularly black capitalism, as being somehow is going to be beneficial to black workers, that you have to have all the different identity groups to come together. And she, in fact, is very conscious that she's opposed to uniting the population on the basis of class. She opposes the concept of working class, and in fact, she blames the workers, for the conditions, even facing so-called, black workers and so forth and so on. We reject this position. There's an interesting article that she wrote in Foreign Affairs, attacking Fukuyama on this question of class warfare. The issues facing the working...
Sounds closer to Mitt Romney.
Sorry?
Said it sounds similar to Mitt Romney.
Yeah, well...
Saying it's not a class... Well, obviously, she's not Mitt Romney, but when Democrats basically say it's not a class issue, it's, we're all in it together and intersectionality and all that stuff. I do think, obviously, the Republican Party is not your friend either if you're black or a worker. But it was like I didn't want to publicly say anything because it's like if you say anything these days about Kamala Harris or Stacey Abrams, you're racist, you're sexist. But I heard a lot of, kind of abstract, vague talk in that State of the Union response. You're not hearing Medicare for all. You're not hearing free public college. You're not hearing any of these things.
They're not interested in a sweeping redistribution of wealth. What they're interested in is a distribution within the top 10% of society. I mean, they're opposed to socialism. They not want to expropriate the private fortunes of the rich. What they're seeking to do, and this is what's behind the Me Too campaign and the focus on racial politics, is the very bitter conflict within the top 10% of society over the distribution of wealth. There's a lot of grievances in that top 10%, whether they're union bureaucrats or university professors or aspiring CEOs and so on. And they weaponize identity politics for this bitter battle. Look what's happening in Virginia right now. They're at each other's throats. And of course, Trump knows how to play them very well as well. But of course, the fact is that class is the fundamental division within society. And that Look, what was Obama, why was he there? I mean, there was immense hatred of Bush. He started a war based on lies. He was an oil man, Halliburton, Dick Cheney, all of this, right? And then the crash of 2008 occurred. Now, how are you going to bail out Wall Street, with an oil man running the country? So then, Obama was brought forward, and millions of workers voted for him, including millions of white workers who said, well, his skin color is black, maybe he's going to be more sympathetic to oppressed people. Well, what did he do? He bailed out Wall Street. None of the criminals that were responsible for that were ever held accountable. He then went to the auto industry, and he halved the wages of the auto workers, got rid of the 8-hour day, handed it over to Wall Street, and as Larry said, the greatest transfer of wealth from the bottom to the top. The stock market more than doubled. The quantitative easing meant free cash for the speculators to reinflate the stock market. And as you correctly said, there was no end to the war. There were more wars. Libya, Syria, and so on. And then the national security state, the spying on the population, the NSA, all of this was expanded. And then we found out, late in that Google was beginning to censor the World Socialist website. Our website was the most popular, it still is the most popular socialist website, but they changed the algorithms on their search engines to make it almost impossible to find our articles, and we raised that.
We have that in common.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And then you have, in the name of fighting, Russian meddling, you have Schiff and all these other Democrats calling for even more censorship. And why are they worried? Because when the teachers went out on strike in West Virginia, they used social media to circumvent the unions and the Democratic Party. Workers are turning towards this social media, and that terrifies the ruling elites. I mean, why does Trump, for the first time, an American president gets on and he says, we have a danger of socialism in America. Now, he's not talking about Alexander Ocasio-Cortez and Sanders. Believe me, he knows exactly what they're all about. What he's worried about is a movement of the working class and a radicalization of the population, anti-capitalist sentiments. More than 50% of the younger generation saying they prefer socialism to capitalism. That's what they're worried about. And by the way, in Macron's France, the president of the rich, there was recently an article in Le Monde Diplomatique in which they were surveying business executives worried about their heads being put on stakes. Remembering, the guillotine. I mean, that is France. So the ruling elites are terrified, and that's why the working class has to have its own independent, in fact, revolutionary party. And workers have to get this dead weight of pseudo-left middle-class politics. When they promote Me Too and racial, that has nothing to do with left politics, as you say. They're not talking about redistributing wealth to the masses of people. All they're talking about is they want to get those positions of affluence and influence in the top. They want to be the CEOs. They want to be the oppressors.
I just want to make sure I'm getting your point. You're not against the Me Too movement, because obviously
we are very, very much against the Me Too. This is a very anti-democratic movement. It's based that you can make an allegation and somebody's career can be destroyed overnight without substantiating anything. It recalls the sort of worst days of the McCarthyite witch hunt, and I mean, of course, the issues of the abuse of women must be opposed. But that's not what this movement is about. This is a movement essentially, of the most upper crust layers. It's about, pushing this CEO out and replacing him with that CEO. They're not talking about the conditions of working class women who are losing their jobs, who are face sexual abuse inside of the auto factories. This is a movement this is what the Democratic Party is basing its politics on. And it began with Clinton. I lost the election because I'm a woman. Nonsense. She's a right-wing shill of Wall Street and a warmonger. That's why she lost the election. And she made it clear her contempt for the working class, the deplorables and all the rest. But this is a narrative that is developed to try to shape everything. That we live in a patriarchy. We live in a white privileged society. Millions of workers, black and white, are oppressed by a tiny layer of the super rich. And workers have to put an end to that system.
If I could bring a point, this is a democratic question. It's a democratic rights question that will affect all sections of the working class, including women. Of course, we're opposed to the oppression, any attacks against women and all the rest. This is not what this is about. As what Jerry was saying, this is about an upper layer which are looking for privileges and to utilize the issue of their gender in order to attack men, but not from the standpoint of expanding democratic and social rights for all. They're getting rid of due process. This is quite serious because this is that means you can utilize evidence against somebody you can utilize a charge against someone without any evidence. Well, that can be used against anybody under any conditions. And look, there is a history to this. Of course, one of the most famous books in America, To Kill a Mockingbird, was in fact against such conditions, that you can somehow make a charge against someone without any evidence and have them basically strung up. We're now bringing this back in a certain sense, but in a different way. And, so the Me Too campaign has nothing to do with the defense of democratic rights. And again, like I said, even against women. If you can now make a charge against someone and you have no evidence at all, but you got to be believed, I mean, where is democratic rights involved here? And someone could say to, for that matter, a woman, look, we believe the following thing and so forth and so on, and say, well, now you're out. There's no, you don't have to present any evidence, prove anything, and so forth and so on. So, and look, when you're talking about the race issue or the gender issue, we live in Detroit, where for last 35, 40 years, the race issue has been utilized for the defense of a black elite in this city, especially under Coleman Young. And what they did was they elevated whole layers of black executives into higher positions. They got money and so forth and so on. The conditions of the working class in this city are worse now than ever before, because that wasn't, this layer was not going to oppose the attacks on jobs, living standards. In fact, the issue of Poletown becomes a major issue with Coleman Young, because he wiped out a whole area of the city in order to have General Motors bring in a plant against the views of the population. And now that plant is itself now being closed down. So they didn't oppose corporations. They didn't oppose big business. They didn't fight for the interests of the working class. And they especially didn't fight for the interests of blacks. They were fighting for their own interest. They were fighting for their own piece of the pie. So the conditions facing the working class, as Jerry was saying, look, we fight to explain to workers and to win them in opposition to all forms of identity politics, nationalism, of gender politics, because this is how they divide the working class. It's another divide and conquer tactic that's now being utilized. And, the only way they're going to be able to fight is if they unite on a basis of class, defend the interests of the entire working class coming together against these.
One thing I'll say that respectfully I disagree with you all on is I think the Me Too movement is actually a good thing. I think, and spoken as somebody who frankly has been accused of something that wasn't true, and there was a very herd mentality, you're kind of guilty by tweet these days, no evidence provided. Fortunately, in my case, when people looked at it, they realized it wasn't true. But I think the Me Too movement is a good thing. I think what's a bad thing, and extends beyond Me Too, is kind of this herd mentality of, if something's trending or there's a charge against someone. I mean, look at Ilhan Omar, the Minnesota congresswoman the other day, who had the temerity to speak out against AIPAC. All of a sudden, there's every news channel, every politician on both sides, they're just saying, anti-Semitic tropes, like it's a fact that she was being anti-Semitic, to the point where, she was forced, probably didn't want to apologize for her, quote, anti-Semitic comment. So I think there's a bit of a herd mentality against whether it's men being accused beyond sexual assault.
Such a...
Is it?
Come on in.
Because I think I kind of, because I'm sitting there and I'm trying to grab a hold of it, because obviously when you hear someone, you say like, no, I'm not. I disagree with it, So then my ears perk up because I'm trying to understand exactly what you're saying. But what it seemed to me that you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, and I get that, is the spirit behind it. Like this, like the Me Too is almost a mask for others to get their own agendas done, versus actually being a genuine thing for something that happened to women, which something that happens all the time. This thing happens all the time. But what they're doing is not about that. It's like what they do with, I guess, what Barack did with Chapter 9, I think now. Like if a college kid is accused, he's kicked out of school. Right. Then they figure it out later. Right. Then that goes against everything that we've fought for. Yes. You know what I mean?
It's an appeal to emotion as opposed to essential democratic rights. I mean, the question is, if Larry referred to To Kill a Mockingbird, in which a black man was accused of raping a girl, and the trial exposed that she was completely false and she had been put up to it. And to tell you the truth, a lot of men who were strung up in the South were accused of raping white women.
The majority of them, Emmett Till, I think the majority of them, Rosewood, that city, like it all was stemmed from a lie, right?
So the issue of presumption of innocence and the issue of due process is a critical democratic right that can't be just dispensed with. And I mean, what's the source of racism? What's the source of the exploitation of women? It's not in the psychology. It's rooted in the capitalist system, in a system in which the vast majority of society is oppressed by a tiny handful, which enriches itself through that oppression and exploitation. And Larry referred to Henry Ford, who brought poor blacks up from the South in the 1930s. By the way, Ford was a great admirer of Adolf Hitler. He was a great anti-Semite at the same time. And he sought very, very consciously to pit one layer of workers against the other, to have them fight one another so he can get away with exploiting all of them. And it's only through the unity of the working class and an understanding that racism or the exploitation of women is rooted in a system of exploitation, not patriarchy or white privilege, no, capitalism.
You know what? This kind of mirrors like what I was talking about the other day, if you remember when we were talking. I can sit right here because this is where the frame is, so we're all in the frame right now. But we talked about how, poor whites for the longest time just been distracted by racism because they was pointing at us just like they're pointing at Mexicans now. But they've been fucked as well, but they just gave them someone to point at. Remember I was explaining that? But I guess I want to make sure people understand, because I think I kind of get it, because I want to make sure you guys are not misunderstood. And if I'm misunderstanding, you tell me. Because
it does come off like we're
yeah. Well, this is what I think. This is what I
the attacks in all
yeah.
form of attack against women. In fact, what was taking place, for example, with the women who were coming up on the caravan through South America up towards the border. Horrible things were being carried against them by various governments and so forth and so on. Nothing was being said about that.
Yeah. Well, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Or for example, what takes place in many of the wars that are taking place in the course, what are the conditions of women there? We absolutely are opposed to rape, attacks against women and so forth and so on. This is absolutely you can't be, in fact, a genuine socialist and defend democratic rights without such a thing. But this is something different. We're now talking about a section of the elite, the upper income layer of women who are utilizing the gender issue for their own interest.
So weaponizing something to, like, that's what they're doing, right? They're grabbing these issues and weaponizing it, not for the greater good of people, but for their getting up on the ladder.
Yes. So as far as they're concerned, it's like what we saw, for example, among blacks. They want to get the positions that maybe someone who's white hold. Well, the women want to get positions that men hold. It has nothing to do with extending democratic or rights for everyone at all. Yeah. It's really it's a selfish policy that's being carried out by a section of the upper income. To get positions of power.
And I guess that's in the sense a form of white supremacy also, right? Because it's an ideology. It's about trying to get to a thing for yourself, knocking people over or doing whatever you got to do, or exploiting something. I guess capitalism, right? Yeah, that's, tomato.
If you look at it historically, I mean, the advent of Jim Crow was actually a response to the growing unity of poor white farmers and black sharecroppers in the South. Mm-hmm. There was a growing movement in the 1880s and 1890s against the miserable conditions, including of the poor white workers. And I've read many testimonials of former Klansmen who said, I was a bloody idiot. I've got far more in common with my black brother than I do with the white owner of the land. So that
goes with, like if people read history, you'll see that. I mean, Malcolm X had people don't talk about it much time, but he had a meeting with the Klansmen, and they had a lot more in common when they started to talk about their oppression here. And
I think that's a different story, because initially Malcolm X was a black nationalist. I mean, that was his view.
Thought everybody should live in different places. Separatists. Okay, I guess they met in that. But listen to the spirit of what I'm saying, though. I guess the spirit of what I'm saying is this: if we started to understand each other, I mean, okay, Bacon's Rebellion, right? So if you go back way back then, when and they started to change laws that would differentiate a slave from an indigent indentured servant. You know what I mean? What they then started to do to kind of make this thing, okay, now you can kill the black slave. Their kids have to be born into slavery. Like, all those things were a reaction to the poor whites and poor blacks coming together, because so it's a thing that's been going on. Like, I agree with what you guys are saying. I think that what my heart, because my heart understands what you guys are saying, but my thing is like, I don't want you to be misunderstood. You know what I'm saying? So that's why I came, because I agree with because it's so nuanced that if you don't take time to like break down exactly what you're saying, on the surface it seems left field and you're like, whoa. But if you think about exactly what you're saying is that it's all disingenuous. It's not about the people. These movements, women, these things do happen to women. These things happen to black people. But these movements, what these people that are in front of these movements are gaining from these movements, it's all exactly.
Right. Well, I'll tell you.
And those are two different things.
Now,
Yeah.
The working class and the socialist movement, of course, historically, absolutely championed the fight for women and to have full rights, including abortion rights, which was advanced by the socialists, and in places like the Bolshevik Revolution, these were first established. And there's a different approach that the working class has to the question of the oppression of women, or racism, than an upper middle class that wants to advance their own interests. The working class has an interest in abolishing all forms of oppression, all forms of exploitation, making sure that every worker has the right to the job, not that black and white students compete against each other for a few spots through affirmative action. No, making sure that all youth have the access to the best educational opportunities, universal, free college education.
We brought that up. We interviewed someone earlier, and one of the things we brought up, you know what? You don't hear that in the Me Too movement. No. This worker that's being sexually harassed by someone at the job,
it's rampant,
like, you don't
inside the plant.
Exactly.
It is absolutely rampant, and in fact, the UAW has been part of that.
And I think to me, I always tell people when I go live that it's always good there's nuance in everything. And I think this is a great topic for conversation. You know what I mean? Because it makes you think. You may agree, you may disagree, but I would love to hear what you guys think about it, because it's very intriguing. Only curious minds are invited.
To button up that topic, what I'm hearing is not that you're against women empowerment and women actually holding men accountable for harassment, assault, but we do need facts when those accusations are sent. What you're really talking about is the co-opting of movements. So whether it's Me Too, there's been talk that some Black Lives Matter leaders were kind of skimming some off the top, or
skimming some off the top. They got $100 million from the Ford Foundation. Since then, you haven't heard much of them, as a matter of fact.
I just want to make sure, because people thought you were basically against like the principles of women standing up. You're just against the co-opting, which I agree with that, because there's a lot of co-opting of other movements, whether it be environmental, civil rights, women. Right. I want to ask you about Detroit specifically, because you see GM's press release. We're doing this. We're going to do these layoffs while the economy is, revved. So that when it's a recession, we'll be agile. Well, what economy are they talking about? What economy is CNN talking about that's booming? Because when I come to Detroit, and I'm not crapping on Detroit, it's not just Detroit. Flint, you got Cleveland, Milwaukee, parts of Pennsylvania. I mean, some of these cities and towns look like an episode of The Walking Dead. Yes. I mean, it's dark, boarded up storefronts.
It wasn't like that always.
Well, that's what I want to get to. So can you kind of talk about this cognitive dissonance that we're seeing from people in New York, people in D.C., people on the coast who say the economy is great? Yeah, for shareholders, for yacht owners, whether it's even before these layoffs, it's not great here.
Well, that's what makes up the public opinion, though, isn't it? Because I mean, the news media, both political parties, you know, they're doing wonderfully. The stock market continues to rise. You know, their personal fortunes continue to rise, but it's all been predicated on a vast transformation that took place, particularly after the 2008 financial crash. Almost 100% of all the, quote, new jobs created under the 8 years of the Obama administration were part-time, contingent, and precarious employment. And that's not only in America, the same thing in the UK. A whole generation has no idea what a steady job is, let alone 30 years career, you know, 30 years and out. Everybody is in this gig economy.
And workers that should be retired by now are Uber drivers and
Exactly. I mean, teachers. I mean, how many teachers have to work are Uber and Lyft drivers? You know, because they're, you know, after the 2008 crash, everything went to Wall Street. The states were not bailed out. The school districts were not bailed out, and Detroit wasn't bailed out. As a matter of fact, there was a terrible financial crisis. The home foreclosures were terrible in 2007. And then the Obama administration, just as they did in the auto industry, exploited the financial crisis to throw Detroit into bankruptcy in 2013. And for the first time, the federal bankruptcy courts overrode the state prohibition in cutting the pensions of public employees. That's illegal under state law, but the Obama administration used the federal courts to supersede the state law. And then they handed over much of the city. First, they were actually trying to sell the art treasures of the DIA, believe it or not, you know. But then they turned over most of the land to Dan Gilbert, to the Ilitch family. They've turned the downtown area more and more sort of a playground for the upper middle class. But the neighborhoods have been decimated. You know, there's you know, empty houses, services have been cut. There's no such thing as a real bus service in the city.
food deserts.
Yeah, food deserts, and this is the same thing. If you look at Dayton, Ohio, which was another GM center, Flint, another GM center, there's been massive deindustrialization. But the more capital was withdrawn from productive processes, the more it went into financialization, which is the bulk of where all the profit making. So when they say the economy is doing good, they're talking about their portfolios, not the interests of the working class.
You have to understand that in the 1950s, Detroit had probably one of the highest living standards of workers in the country. You certainly had one of the highest number of single home owners in this country. And then up until the 1970s, you would go to many Detroit neighborhoods and they were absolutely pristine. Enormous, pride in their neighborhoods. Workers took care of the homes, and because they had a decent living standard. It was not unusual for workers to have a house up north, to have a boat, and they certainly were able to put their kids into college and have a decent living standards and retire after 30 years. That all changed in the 1970s. And as Jerry was saying, you had the policy of deindustrialization, which not only affected the workers, of course, in Detroit, but every major industrial center in the country, Gary, Indiana, Chicago, Cleveland, every major city went through this crisis. They began shutting down plants. In Detroit, the Detroit area had more than, I think, close to 100 auto plants. It was a good reason it was called the auto capital of the world. There's now, I think, 2 auto plants now left. And
shut one of them.
And the Chrysler especially dominated, the area. I think they had something close to 40 plants within the area, and they were all virtually closed in the course of the 1980s. From 1979, when they had the bailout, up until 1993, Detroit was transformed from a prosperous city to the largest poor city in the country. So this was not something which was because of the failure of the people, but in fact it was a policy being carried out by the corporations, big business, to destroy the living standards of the working class, aided by the unions. I mean, significantly, Mark Stepp and others who were, who's the vice president of the UAW, work with the companies to decide which plants should be closed down, especially the more militant plants. And there was a long history of struggles in Detroit, especially the rank and file, wildcat strikes, absolute opposition to social conditions. When I worked at Chrysler, it was not unusual. If that plant was too hot and the conditions too bad, people were going out. This was not unusual. And there was enormous militance in opposition to the conditions. And at that time, then, the unions, one could say, did, in a more distorted form, it had to reflect the interests of the workers. It was after that period that it began to change. And with the Chrysler Agreement in 1979, the bailout, the UAW was put onto the board of directors of the company for the first time. The union actually changed its constitution from saying it was antagonistic to the interests of the company to saying it was working in relationship with the company. They more and more got rid of, especially many of the old conditions. They started pitting one section of workers against another in order to force through concessions. And again, they suppressed any strike movement whatsoever. So this has been a long period, in fact, of downsliding, and the conditions in Detroit show it. I mean, if you were saying that and it's true that Detroit looks like a bomb just went through the city, it's because of the social devastation carried out by plant closures, which has led to the situation. And now they're going to carry out even more plant closures, and which is going to further erode the living standards and the rights, of working people. And that's why people are saying enough is enough. That's a very common refrain. Now, people are saying enough is enough now. We've given concessions. We gave everything they could in terms of even bailing out the company, and still we get thrown out into the street. So there's nothing that's going to change fundamentally until workers themselves begin to reorganize society on a different basis.
My last question is, we could talk the talk, but how do people, because people watching, a lot of them are activists, a lot of them are working 2 to 3 jobs. A lot of them were Bernie volunteers or whatever. I know you got your qualms with even Bernie, but how do people take what you're talking about into action to actually form an international coalition of workers? Because I agree, you can't fight international multi-billion-dollar corporate conglomerates with a protest on the curb. It needs to be a coordinated thing. That's a heavy task. So how do you even begin, not just in the auto industry, but workers everywhere?
Well, I mean, the social anger is emerging everywhere. There's a growth of the class struggle, and that's an objective process, especially since the 2008 crash, the vast explosion of social inequality. Opposition, anti-capitalist sentiment is worldwide, but the central issue is leadership and political program, and building a party. We're members of the Socialist Equality Party. Our international movement is known as the International Committee of the Fourth International, and our movement has decades upon decades of struggle fighting to build an international party of the working class against Stalinism and the claims you could build socialism in a single country, which led to the liquidation of the Soviet Union, against the nationalism in the trade unions, and against all of those who said there's some easy road, whether it was Castro or Mandela or so forth. And all of these organizations that base themselves on a national perspective have collapsed. So we think the most essential question is building a leadership, having a program that corresponds to the historical interests of the working class. And we are the only ones that fight for the development of independent forms of organization, breaking free from the grip of these national and pro-capitalist unions. And we are building an international party because humanity is really at a crossroads. I mean, the advances in science and technology make mankind more integrated, more productive than at any point in human history. But the division of the world into rival nation states, the subordination of everything to private profit, now poses the danger of the destruction of humanity, not to mention the destruction of the environment, which is also part of that. So we believe the issue isn't, as Sanders or Ocasio-Cortez say, reform, that you can reform the system. No, the system is unreformable. It is a question of revolution. or fascism and war. So we're building a party, and we hope that your listeners will go to our website, the World Socialist website. It's the most widely read socialist publication on the internet, and study our history. And we urge those who seriously to join our movement and to fight for it. We also have a youth movement called the International Youth and Students for Social Equality. So we urge you, once again.
You have an address for it?
Well, we should go to wsws.org, World Socialist website, and you can look up about the Socialist Equality Party and our youth movement, the International Youth and Students for Social Equality.
So basically what I'm hearing is burn the whole thing down and rebuild.
No, we're not burning anything down. What we're saying is that we have to transfer the means of society over to the working class. It has to be reorganized on the basis of workers' interest, not on the basis of the capitalist system. They're at a deep crisis. This system is going to and everywhere you go. I mean, every country right now is in phenomenal crisis right now. They don't have any answers themselves. Europe, the EU is breaking apart. South America, you now have in Bolsonaro and others, you have literally fascistic governments now coming into power. South Africa, I mean, everywhere you go now, there's an international crisis facing the capitalist system.
Chris Hedges says it's basically late-stage capitalism, and the middle class is like a rotting carcass.
Well, what we're raising is that the only social force which is progressive under capitalism today is the working class, not because of the way it thinks, but because of its social position within society. It is not tied at all to the profit motive or to the interests of the capitalist system. And because of that reason, it's the only force so it can play the role of reorganizing society on the basis of democratic and social interests, not on the drive for profit or the exploitation of one man against another man, or one woman against another woman for that matter. I mean, and today we're living in a situation today, as Jerry was just raising, where we have enormous dangers as well. It isn't just a matter of a good idea. We face the danger of another war, and also fascistic governments now coming to power to smash the interests of the working class. And without a new way forward, we face another catastrophe. We believe that there is a way forward, and that is by the development of an international movement of the working class in unity in opposition to the capitalist system itself, which is riding on its carcasses. They don't have an answer at all to any of the problems in a progressive way to take mankind forward. And the only way it's going to happen is if the working class becomes conscious of these social interests and carries out the necessary transformation to take mankind forward, including that of the environment.
Which means socialism. I mean, as I said, the technology and science makes mankind more productive than at any point. If society's wealth, which is created collectively by the working class, is controlled by the working class, then instead of money being squandered on war and bank bailouts and corporate tax cuts, it's to vastly improve the living standards of all workers around the world. And the great technological advances, if they were controlled democratically. I mean, look, GM is shutting plants which have productive capacity. And they're doing it for one purpose solely, to boost the profits of their shareholders. They are vandals. They're destroying society. How much it goes into the stock market, to the Pentagon budget? If the working class took political power, which is what we're fighting for, organize the socialist transformation of society, real socialism, and that means utilizing the great developments of the productive capacity of mankind all over the world in a planned, democratically organized fashion, scientific fashion.
Well, as I always say, we're halfway there. We already have a socialist country. It's only for the rich. So we're all paying for it. So thank you, guys. I appreciate it.
Since we addressed it on camera, about the Black Lives Matter, the $100 million. I saw something that I guess the Washington Times posted, that they did an article saying that Ford Motors donated $100 million to Black Lives Matter, but that was found to be false. That it was the let me find this because Huh?
It's Ford Foundation.
So it wasn't the Ford, but it wasn't.
Ford Motor Company, it was the Ford Foundation.
So, but what I'm saying is, it wasn't Ford Motor Funds, I guess, but it wasn't to Black Lives Matter. It was to, they have a similar name, so that's where it seemed like the mistake may have come. Just so you guys can.
You're saying they didn't?
They did not to Black Lives Matter. It was to, because I guess it was a big thing. It was the movement for Black Lives is what it was donated to. So not Black Lives Matter.
Black Lives Matter was sort of an umbrella type organization. It has many different components within it, and in fact, there's this outlook within Black Lives Matter of opposing centralization. And one of the problems that the Ford Motor Company, the Ford Foundation had was, who do you give the money to? And because there were so many, they were so decentralized in terms of its organization.
But do you know that this was the only reason I'm pushing back on it, because I think that I think almost the same type of propaganda that's put that had been and still is put out about the Black Panthers kind of are put out like they're a racist hate group. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? So when certain things come out about them, I just like to fact check it to make sure it's it. And
no, actually, we did an article about the Ford Foundation money going to Black Lives Matter. There's no question about it. And as a matter of fact, it's well recognized within their organization. The Cincinnati group split from Black Lives Matter because they felt it had been too co-opted into the policies of the Democratic Party and and so forth.
Could you send me that? I would like to read it.
Sure.
For sure, because you like to be informed, right?
Well, thank you very much.
No
anyway.
problem. I appreciate you guys.
So you could find their work, WSWS.org. For more, like you said, through Google's, let's say, free speech shenanigans, it's not as easy to find. So WSWS.org. And we will be in Detroit for another day or two. Then we're going to Lordstown, Ohio. We're going to be live some of the time. Some of the times we're not going to be live. We just uploaded earlier today a kind of a mishmash of our coverage last night. I guarantee you'll never see anything like this on CNN. There were people singing and folk song and people screaming. It was wonderful. But actual people, working people, retired auto workers and current auto workers. We did some interviews today. We're going to do another interview now. So we appreciate all your support. Of course, if you got a couple bucks, support us through our GoFundMe. Just go to GoFundMe, click on Status Coup. It's also in the description of this video. You could find our GoFundMe link. We're getting closer to a $50,000 raised, but we're actually showing you what we're going to do with the money. We're covering basically, in my view, the controlled demolition of whatever the middle class is left with. And also, you can become a Status Coup member. That's how we're going to grow long term. You could do it as low as $5 a month. Stop going to Starbucks and paying for overpriced lattes. $5 a month, $10 a month. You're going to get bonus content, special behind-the-scenes content. Some of it will be very absurd. Some of it will be very outrageous, but it will be raw and authentic. And most of all, support independent media that actually covers real things, not just Russia and Trump's tweets 24/7. We'll see you in a bit. Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, interesting discussion.
Yeah, I got to rethink